Today we will be taking a trip around America about organized crime. Our first stop is in New York at Ellis Island. From 1880 to 1910, there was a huge influx of immigrants, much of whom were Italians. These Italians were searching for a new home or a fresh start to life. Life was a lot different back then, and a lot of these Italians brought over their connections and groups of gangs to America. With the police and government not seeing this threat coming, or as serious a threat, these mafias started to thrive. First gaining reputation from the streets, then moving to find fingerholds in local governments, and finally rising to power of being able to control parts of cities. The second stop on our trip is Little Italy in New York. In the late 19th and early 20th century, waves of Italian immigrants flocked to America in search of economic opportunities. The Italian immigrants included farmers, craftsmen, and unskilled laborers. During this massive influx of immigrants at the time, New York's population of Italian immigrants skyrocketed from 20,000 to 250,000 between 1880 and 1890. The majority of these immigrants were law-abiding, but with the large group of immigrants, it also contained criminals who formed neighborhood gangs in these communities. The third stop on our trip is Alcatraz in California. From 1920 to 1930, Alcatraz saw a huge amount of arrested gang members and mafia leaders. This prison held some of the most notorious organized crime members out there. Al Capone was admitted into this prison just like others. Alcatraz was in its prime just when these crime movements started to spring up and gain ground. This prison also held a lot of corruption, as these leaders like Capone would come in and live substantially better than they were supposed to. The fourth stop on our trip is Richard's Bar in Chicago. The 1920s saw this rise of power and organized crime, as well as atmospheres change in most cities. Chicago was a huge epicenter for these mafias. People's attire changed, businesses became known for certain groups, and everybody accepted this change because it was their main source of booze and contraband. Richard's Bar in Chicago is a prime example of this. This dive bar saw gangs throughout the day, at breakfast, at lunch, and well into the late night. Huge members in this community came here to show off their power in their big groups and spend large amounts of money on food and drink. These places were the staging areas for people like Al Capone to gain power and respect in their communities. Our fifth stop on our trip is the Federal Building in New York. In 1970, the Crime Control Act was signed as a measure aimed at mafias and other crime syndicates. This law's objective was to standardize rules for witnesses, which included perjury, witness protection, recalcitrant witnesses, and witness self-incrimination. This also elevated local criminal activity to the status of federal crimes in certain cases. Overall, this document was to seek eradication of organized crime in the United States. This was a huge step forward for a lot of the federal people in the U.S. because it helped to get rid of a lot of these major issues caused by these mafias. Our sixth stop is Mulberry Street in New York. 5 families divided up the power in New York, with each of their own geographic boundaries created in 1931 to stop turf wars happening between them. The 5 families are the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. The only organization that is above them is the Commission, which is composed of bosses from the 5 families and the Buffalo and Chicago mobs. Our 7th stop is Hazleton Penitentiary in the United States. James Bulger, also known by the name Whitey, was one of South Boston's most notorious mobsters and an FBI informer. Whitey was on the run for 16 years, trying to evade capture from the FBI while he was on the most wanted list. During the lifetime of Whitey, he was committed multiple acts which included murder, extortion, and snitching. Once Whitey arrived at Hazleton, he was gruesomely beat to death with a padlock that was hidden inside a sock. The person whom authorities believed Whitey was killed by was a fellow mobster with the name Photios Gaze, who was said to have beaten Whitey to the point that he was unrecognizable. This goes to show how serious this matter can get at times, even though this is a more modern example. Our 8th stop on our trip is the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. During the early 1850s, Estes Kefauver was a U.S. senator from Tennessee. He launched an investigation into organized crime as a whole, and he also held public hearings. This was a huge step for society because American mafias had not been publicly recognized by the federal governments yet. Due to lack of evidence, the FBI and other enforcement agencies were not able to take action against the American mafia whatsoever. The announcements were merely used to give information about how the American mafia operates in the U.S. Our 9th stop is Tioga County, New York. In 1957, in a small upstate town in New York named Appalachian, a small police force decided to raid a gathering of more than 60 mobsters from all over the country. After the raid, the aftermath that occurred was regarded as the largest movement against the mafia. Because of this movement, the government could not ignore the actions of the American mafia anymore. They were able to get a ton of information and evidence from this raid, which led to a bunch of closed cases, leading more on to the takedown of a lot of huge mob families. Our 10th and final stop is Woolworth Building in Manhattan. Mob boss Lucky Luciano's demise was constructed by Thomas E. Dewey, who would be a future New York governor and presidential candidate. In 1936, he was a special prosecutor who investigated organized crime. Dewey himself led an evening raid on 80 different New York brothels, which were rumored to be part of a massive mafia-controlled prostitution ring. By midnight of that, plainclothes cops had brought 125 prostitutes, madams, and bookers to the Woolworth Building. Dewey and his team convinced 68 of the 125 that they brought to the Woolworth Building to testify against Lucky Luciano. Even thought the famous monster was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. He still was regarded as a large figure in the American mafia.